Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present an analysis of a concerning trend in the European Union's economic situation. The global economic landscape has undergone a seismic shift over the last 3 decades, transitioning from a Western-dominated hierarchy to a more complex tripolar dynamic. This evolution is best characterized by the diverging trajectories of the world's three largest economic blocs: the United States, China, and the European Union. While many predicted that the rise of emerging markets would erode American economic hegemony, the United States has displayed a remarkable ability to maintain its relative standing. In 1990, the U.S. commanded roughly 25% to 26% of global nominal GDP. Fast forward to the 2024-2025 period, and that figure remains virtually unchanged. By successfully leveraging its tech-heavy index and innovation-driven sectors, the U.S. has defied the relative decline narrative that often plagues established superpowers, remaining the bedrock of the global economy. The most disruptive force in this period has undoubtedly been the explosive growth of China. In 1990, China was a minor economic player, accounting for a mere 1.6% of the world's GDP. Through decades of rapid industrialization and integration into global trade, that share skyrocketed to over 17% by 2023. By 2025, with a nominal GDP estimated at $19.23 trillion, China has moved beyond its role as the world's factory to become a peer competitor, effectively matching the economic weight of the entire European Union. In stark contrast to China's rise and America's stability, the European Union has experienced a significant relative decline. The numbers tell a sobering story of lost ground. In 2008, the EU's economy was actually 110% the size of the US total. By 2023, that figure had plummeted to just 67% of the US total. Once significantly larger than the Chinese economy, the EU now finds itself in a dead heat with China for the second-place spot, struggling to keep pace with the technological and energy cost advantages enjoyed by its rivals. Key takeaway: the narrative of the 21st century is not just about the rise of the East, but also the stalling of the West in Europe. As the US manages to hold its ground, while the EU's share of the global pie continues to contract. The European Union, once a beacon of economic integration, is increasingly viewed as a giant whose strength is being sapped by self-inflicted wounds. While external geopolitical factors play a role, the primary drivers of the EU's economic stagnation are internal: a deep-seated culture of risk aversion, an obsession with preemptive regulation, and a disjointed approach to strategic challenges. This speech examines how the Brussels effect has morphed into a bureaucratic cage that hinders innovation and erodes competitiveness against global peers like the USA and China. This speech will address the primary drivers behind these developments, which are causing widespread concern among EU citizens. The defining characteristic of the modern EU economy is the precautionary principle on steroids. Unlike the American approach, which generally allows technologies to develop before regulating them, the EU seeks to legislate against potential risks before a market even exists. The AI Act is the prime example of this rigid landscape. By imposing strict compliance rules on artificial intelligence before European champions have truly emerged, the EU risks suffocating the industry in its cradle. Instead of fostering an ecosystem where the next open AI can thrive, the focus is on liability and restriction. This bureaucratic idealism extends to consumer protection. The EU operates under the assumption that if consumers are bombarded with information, they will make better decisions. The data, however, proves this information model is broken. The click fatigue reality. Research consistently shows that the notice and consent model has failed. Studies indicate that over 90% of consumers accept terms and conditions without reading them. A classic study by McDonald and Craner estimated that if the average person actually read every privacy policy they encountered, it would cost them 76 workdays per year. The result is not an educated consumer, but a frustrated one who blindly clicks accept all just to make the pop-ups disappear. Financial disclosures. In consumer credit, the reliance on complex metrics like the APR, RRSO, and lengthy standard European consumer credit information sheets has failed. Research on financial literacy shows that consumers focus almost exclusively on the monthly installment amount, often ignoring the APR because the calculation methodology is too abstract, even for many professionals. The EU forces banks to produce millions of pages of disclosures that technically satisfy a directive, but are practically invisible to the borrower. The sheer volume of red tape in Europe has reached critical mass. While the United States is often criticized for its bureaucracy, a comparison of the regulatory landscape reveals a stark disparity. Based on estimated legislative output, USA. The Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, currently stands at approximately 190,000 pages. EU. Estimates suggest that from 1990 to 2023 alone, the EU generated roughly 540,000 pages of regulations, based on approximately 1,200 regulations, year averaging 15 pages each. This suggests the EU burden is roughly 3 times heavier than that of the US federal system. For a business, this acts as a massive tax on productivity, diverting resources from R&D to compliance departments. The scale of compliance spending has shifted from a marginal operational expense to a multi-billion euro industry. GDPR. Large enterprises reported initial and ongoing costs ranging from $1.7 million to $70 million annually. A 2025 study by Bocconi University found that GDPR-exposed firms saw an average 8% drop in profits and a 2% decrease in sales. ESG. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, is estimated to cost the largest EU companies an average of $1.4 million per year just for reporting and auditing. Total annual costs for the EU corporate sector to meet new nature reporting standards are projected to reach $39 billion, $45 billion. Estimates for the total annual administrative burden of EU regulations reach $150 billion. This does not include indirect burdens, such as companies choosing not to invest in new products due to regulatory uncertainty. The transition from the 20th to the 21st century has seen a radical reallocation of human capital. OECD data 2025 indicates that the share of labor resources devoted to compliance-related tasks in Europe rose from 3.7% in 2011 to 3.9% in 2023, consistently higher than in the United States. Major firms now dedicate hundreds of thousands of engineering hours to compliance rather than R&D. For example, Meta reportedly spent 590,000 engineering hours just on initial compliance for new EU digital laws. Large firms now spend an average of $64 million per year solely on external legal fees, contractors, and audits to navigate the EU's digital legislative landscape, which grew from 27 pages in 2015 to over 930 pages in 2024. Furthermore, there is a lack of historical data linking massive compliance departments to loss prevention. Every euro spent on a compliance officer is a euro not spent on R&D. Research indicates that a 1% increase in regulatory compliance costs is associated with a 0.1% decline in labor productivity and a 1.6% decline in revenue growth. The 20th century corporation was a vehicle for production. The 21st century corporation is becoming a vehicle for reporting. By institutionalizing safety through a massive compliance class, the EU has traded the dynamic growth of the previous century for a static, expensive oversight regime that can quantify its costs to the cent, but its benefits only in slogans. Today, the corporation has been transformed into a quasi-regulatory arm of the state. A modern EU bank or tech firm employs thousands of compliance professionals. These aren't just lawyers. They are climate data analysts, AML experts, know your customer specialists, and IT resilience auditors. Regulations are now prescriptive. You are told what you must do. That is, for example, you must map every data flow. You must audit your supplier's electricity source. The burden of proof has shifted. You are guilty of non-compliance until you produce the paperwork to prove otherwise. Compliance teams do not build products, sell services, or find new markets. Their sole output is documentation. Under CSRD, companies are now social accountants. They are forced to police global supply chains, tasks that were historically the job of government diplomats or labor inspectors. This shift has created a self-perpetuating audit trap. In the 1980s, if a company had a legal problem, it was an anomaly. Today, because the rules like MiFID II or ESG taxonomies are so complex, it is mathematically impossible to be 100% compliant. This forces companies into a permanent cycle of hiring more consultants to fix findings from the previous year's audit. The result? A massive transfer of wealth from productive industries, manufacturing, tech, energy, to unproductive service industries, legal, audit, consultancy. The green trap, ideology over economics. Nowhere is the disconnect between policy and market reality more visible than in the energy and automotive sectors. The cost of doing business in Europe is crushing its industrial base. As of 2024, industrial electricity prices in the EU averaged around 0.1999 per kilowatt hour, compared to just 0.075 bars per kilowatt hour in the USA and roughly 0.0082 in China. This means European manufacturers are paying nearly 2.6 times more for power than their American counterparts. The cost of carbon. This price gap is driven partly by the EU Emissions Trading System, ETS. While US companies face little to no federal carbon tax, European companies are paying market rates that have fluctuated between $60 and $85 per ton of CO2 in 2024-2025. The EV transition. The aggressive push to ban combustion engines has forced European automakers to invest billions in electric vehicles, EVs, before the market is fully ready. In late 2024, despite massive investments, the market share of battery electric vehicles, BEVs, in Europe hovered around 19%, with growth stalling as soon as subsidies, like those in Germany, were removed. Manufacturers are bleeding cash on a transition forced by regulation rather than consumer demand, while Chinese competitors, benefiting from state subsidies and cheaper energy, capture the lower end of the market. The EU faces a demographic winter, with aging populations threatening the welfare state. Ideally, this would be met with a wise immigration policy, welcoming skilled labor and those willing to assimilate, similar to the successful integration of Ukrainians in Poland. Instead, the EU struggles with a chaotic approach to illegal immigration has allowed entry to large numbers of migrants from regions with low assimilation rates. This lack of control has fueled the rise of right-wing extremism, which acts as a destabilizing force. Unlike China or Russia, where few wish to emigrate, the West is a destination of choice. The EU fails to leverage this position to be selectively meritocratic, missing the opportunity to attract the specific talent needed to sustain its economy. Finally, the promise of a unified European market remains largely unfulfilled due to particularism and protectionism. Gold plating. Member states frequently add their own extra layers of regulation to EU directives, creating a fragmented landscape. A company cannot simply scale across Europe. It must navigate 27 distinct compliance regimes. Protectionism. National interests frequently override the common good. For example, by blocking cross-border banking consolidation, member states prevent the creation of European financial giants capable of competing with U.S. heavyweights like J.P. Morgan or Chinese state banks. We saw this risk aversion peak during the pandemic. Governments across the West chose a path of risk avoidance that led to long-term economic ruin. By cutting off the arm to save a finger, we triggered skyrocketing real estate prices and inflation that has ruined the perspectives of our youth. Contrast this with Sweden. By avoiding legally enforced lockdowns, they achieved the lowest excess mortality in the EEA by 2025. It was a clear example of shifting responsibility to health specialists who, by definition, did not factor economic devastation into their equations. Last year, Mario Draghi released a landmark report that serves as our existential warning. His findings are a direct validation of this crisis. Of 147 unicorns founded in the EU, 40 have relocated abroad, mostly to the US, specifically to escape our regulatory complexity. EU firms invest only half as much in private research as their US counterparts. Our single market is a myth. Companies must still navigate 27 distinct national regimes, leading to a 20% increase in data management costs. While the United States has solidified its position as a global leader in technology, military power, and raw economic output, Europe has found itself caught in a slow-motion stagnation. However, before we resign ourselves to a bleak future, we must acknowledge that the European model still offers a quality of life that our American peers often envy. Where Europe still leads, despite the widening GDP gap, the European Union remains a lifestyle superpower. In several key metrics, the EU continues to outperform the USA. Our healthcare systems are designed as a right, not a luxury. While the US leads in medical innovation, the EU leads in universal coverage, ensuring a broken leg doesn't lead to bankruptcy. The pension systems across the EU provide a level of security in old age that is far more robust than the fragmented 401k model in the States. Europe remains a place where living is not secondary to working. Mandated vacation times and labor protections lead to human-centric policy. We cannot, however, not take into account that these solutions are costly. Our current social contracts are becoming skewed toward the elderly. We are effectively funding the security of the retired generation and work-life balance guarantees on the backs of a shrinking, overtaxed youth. This intergenerational transfer of wealth is sustainable only if the economy grows, and right now, it isn't. The trend lines are clear. If the trajectory of the last 3 decades continues, characterized by low innovation, energy dependency, and regulatory strangulation, Europe risks becoming a museum of the world, beautiful to visit, but no longer relevant to the future. We have the foundation of a fantastic place to live. Now, we need the economic courage to ensure it stays that way for the next generation. When the architects of the modern European economy, such as Mario Draghi, admit that data management costs have spiked by 20% while global competitiveness plummets, the 20th century model of lean governance looks less like a relic and more like a lost competitive advantage. Today's CEOs are no longer managing markets. They are managing the compliance class that Draghi warns is stifling the very innovation needed to pay for the EU's social safety nets. The European Union's economic decline is not inevitable, but it is currently structural. By prioritizing risk avoidance over growth, the EU has created a landscape where it is expensive to produce, difficult to innovate, and legally treacherous to operate. To reverse this trend, Europe must shift from a philosophy of restriction to one of pragmatism, lowering energy costs, rationalizing the regulatory burden, and prioritizing the creation of global champions over the protection of national silos.